Hey friends, it's Jessica from Three Rivers Homestead, and on a recent video I had a request to share our process for rendering lard, and since that was what was on the agenda for today, I thought I'd bring you guys along to show you the process. I just pulled the 2 bags of pork fat out of the freezer, and I'm going to let them thaw for a couple hours to make it a little easier to cut it up into chunks. And while we're waiting on that to thaw, we're going to get going with our morning chores, and we'll do a little bit of school. So why don't you come along with us today on our day. So we are almost done with school. Gracie's finished and she's helping me watch the baby, and Elizabeth is finishing up her spelling list. I thought I'd take a minute to talk to you about lard and why it's so important to us and our family's diet. You may not know that we're a dairy-free family, and this is because my oldest son has an anaphylactic allergy to dairy. He also has one to peanuts. And this means we can't even have those items in our house because of cross-contamination. And so that can be quite a challenge if you're a family that does a lot of baking like us. There's butter or milk or some other dairy product in just about every recipe. We've had to learn to substitute a lot. And lard for us is the perfect substitution for butter. And we use it a lot in things like pie crusts or biscuits. It just makes a great finished product. We think it's a healthy food. I know that there are differing opinions on that. There was quite a smear campaign on fat back in maybe the 1980s, and they decided that all fat is bad, and everything became fat-free, low-fat, and thus high sugar, which just wrecked the health of the American people. We're seeing the fallout of that now, decades later. And I guess what I feel like they failed to recognize during that time was that there is a difference between fats. They're not all created equally. The highly processed, chemically made, hydrogenated fats, those are not so healthy. But fat in its pure form, in the way nature intended, such as maybe a home-rendered lard, that's much healthier, I guess, in my opinion. And sourcing matters. I would never buy a shelf-stable hydrogenated lard that they sell in the grocery store. I don't know anything about that animal and how it was cared for and what toxins and things could have accumulated in its fat before it was rendered. But I do know that about animals that I raised myself or that a trusted source raised. And so for us, we will only eat the lard if we know about the animal. And that's an important thing to know. Just like I mentioned, lard or fat can accumulate toxins, medications, antibiotics, things like that an animal could have had access to. But fat can accumulate good things like vitamin D. Lard is one of the, if not the highest dietary sources of vitamin D. And this is because if the animal is raised on pasture and it has access to sunlight, it absorbs the vitamin D through its skin from the sun, and then that accumulates in the fat, and then we in turn get that vitamin D when we consume the fat. And we also as a nation are very vitamin D deficient, so having that dietary source is really important. And I guess anything in moderation. You know, if all we were eating is lard, that probably wouldn't be great for us, but it can be a great addition to your diet. It gives you nutrients that you need. So we feel it's very important. So our fat has been sitting out for a couple of hours now. I find it's best to cut apart when it's just slightly thawed. If you let it get completely thawed, it gets really greasy and a little harder to manage. So we just let it thaw a couple hours, and then we can cut it up into chunks and get it in the pot, which we're about to do. There are several ways to do this. Essentially, with rendering lard, all you're doing is taking the pork fat and you're melting it down. You're allowing all of the solids that are attached to it, because there will be little pieces of flesh or skin that are attached to the fat, obviously. As it melts, those will float to the surface and become what's called cracklins, and that's another tasty treat you get out of this process. And then everything that melted will be in a liquid form, and you can pour that all into jars, and it will harden and solidify, and that will be your lard. Now there are several ways to do this. The easiest would be to cut it up and put it in a crock pot and just let it slowly melt throughout the day. And that's one way that I normally do it. The downside to that is that your house smells like lard for quite a long time because the process takes a while. Remember, if you are going to use a crock pot, you want to put a little bit of water in the bottom of the crock pot before you put your cubed fat in. That will prevent it from burning and sticking to the bottom and ruining your lard and giving it like a burnt taste. So just a little bit of water, and don't worry, that will evaporate through this process and won't ruin your finished product. The way I'm doing it today is I'm cubing up the fat here, and I'm doing it on the stove. And I did the same thing. I put just a tiny bit of water in the bottom of the pot to prevent it from sticking until the fat starts to melt a little bit and has a liquid in the bottom, and that will evaporate out. So let me show you what's going on here. So this is what I was talking about. Here's my big chunk of fat, and you can see that there is some flesh and probably some skin in there. And like I said, don't worry, that will float to the top. And here I have the little cubes. The smaller you cut it, the faster it'll go. There have been times where I'm in a rush where I have run my lard through a meat grinder just to make it melt super quickly. Today I'm not doing that. I'm just cubing it, and then we'll let this cook on low all day. I'll probably cover the pot to help speed up the process, and it'll slowly melt down. I'm keeping it on low so that I don't scorch or burn anything. And like I mentioned, I do have a little bit of water in the bottom of this to prevent sticking here in the beginning stages, and that will evaporate. So I'm just going to get busy cubing this up and getting it in the pot. Got a fussy little guy here that I'm going to go need to feed, so I have a helper right here, my main man David in the kitchen. He's taking over and cutting up the rest of this for me. So I'm going to feed the baby, and then we'll come back and see what we've got going on here. Thanks to David, we've got this all cubed up and in our pots, and what I'm going to do is cover them and just kind of let them melt down here for a while on the stove while I prepare lunch. Okay, it's been about an hour and a half now that the fat has been melting down here on the stove, and I just came in to check on it. And I just wanted to remind you to make sure you stir this every now and then so that nothing sticks to the bottom. And if you do find that it's kind of sticking, you just need to stir it around and get some of that fat on the bottom to prevent that from happening more. So let me show you what it looks like now. This package of fat had a lot more meat and solids on it. So you can kind of see those cooking up in there versus this one over here. But we're working on it slowly, and pretty soon here I'll start removing some of this lard and get it in jars. While I'm waiting, I'll talk to you a little bit about how I store our lard. I prefer to use wide mouth jars because once this solidifies, you're going to be scooping it out of the jar using a spoon, and the narrow mouth jars, it's just a little harder to get it out. So do yourself a favor and use something with a wider mouth. Lard is shelf stable as long as you got, all of those solids and everything out of it and you strained it and it's just the lard in it. It's shelf stable for about 6 months, or you can put it in the fridge and it'll last up to a year or maybe longer. If you put it in the freezer, obviously it will last even longer than that. So I like to store it in my fridge. I put it on the shelves of my overflow fridge in our garage, and because we're going to use it up within the next 6 months, most likely. Very rarely have I had lard last longer than a year. So the fridge works fine for us, but if you have a smaller family or you don't use it quite as often, you may want to use the freezer, because that'll make it last for a few years. Let's see if I can do this one-handed. I like to kind of strain it as I go, so I'm just going to skim off the liquid and start filling my jar. I use a funnel with a little screen in it to catch any of the solid pieces, and I'm just going to fill my jars as I get enough liquid. So what you'll find as you're skimming your melted fat off and putting it in your jars is, as you get to the bottom of your pot, there'll be more and more sediment, tiny pieces of flesh or skin or whatever that can be mixed in with the melted fat. And so to avoid that settling in your jars, what you can do is strain it through something a little better, like use a coffee filter or maybe some cheesecloth or something to catch and trap all of the tiny particles that are going to be in there. I usually don't go to that trouble. What I do is that sediment will slowly sink to the bottom of your jar, and you'll find that at the bottom you'll see little bits of things, and the top will be the solid lard. And since I'm storing it in the fridge, I don't really worry about that sediment. I'll use the top of the jar for baking, and as I start to get to the bottom, the very bottom of the jar, and I know that there might be some bits of meat or whatever mixed in with that, that's what I'll use for cooking fat. And so that's what solves that problem for us. But if you wanted your lard to be pristine and perfect and have a whole jar for baking, then you would need to filter it really well to get rid of any tiny bits of sediment that could be in there. Another important distinction that needs to be made is between what's called the leaf lard and the rest of the fat that is on the animal. The leaf lard is the prized lard that would be the best for baking and things like that, because it has very little of a porky flavor. It's the lard that comes from around the kidneys of the animals, so there isn't, flesh and skin that's attached to it, and so that is what most bakers would want to use in their baking. The rest of the fat that we're rendering down today, because it has that skin and flesh attached to it, there might be a hint of a porky flavor. And as I mentioned before, I noticed that the closer I get to the bottom of the jar, the stronger that flavor is. And unfortunately, there isn't enough leaf lard in the animal to get us through an entire year of baking, and so we do have to rely on the regular, more porky flavored lard for our baked goods. And we're used to that. Honestly, if you're baking something that's mixed with sugar, you don't notice the flavor at all. You would literally have to be eating plain lard to notice the pork taste. And so it's just a preference. And for us, it works. That's what we have to do because there just isn't enough leaf lard to go around. But that's something to keep in mind. Right here we have the cracklins from the first batch of lard. The larger pot is still rendering down, but this is what cracklins look like, and I'll explain to you the difference between cracklins and pork rinds. If you've ever had pork rinds, they're very similar to the cracklins. The difference is that pork rinds are just the skin with the fat removed, and then that skin is deep fried, and then you get that crispy pork rind. With the cracklins, you're getting the remains of the lard rendering process, and so any bits of skin that are left are going to have a little bit of fat left on them. So the taste will be very similar to a pork rind. It's just going to be a little meatier, fattier when you chew on it. But they still are crispy. You can salt them, you can flavor them. They're a nice little snack treat. There's also other culinary uses for them. You could use them as a topping for, let's say, a green bean casserole to replace maybe the fried onions. All sorts of things that you can do with them. And if you don't like them, animals love them. My chickens love them. So I'm sure there's a good way to put that to use without having it go to waste. When your lard is still hot and liquid, it's going to be this yellowish kind of golden color. And then slowly as it cools and solidifies, it will turn a white color. The purer the lard, the whiter it will be. Your leaf lard is going to be white as snow, and then any of the other kinds of lard can sometimes have an off-white color, maybe even a grayish color, I guess. But you can see the difference between the ones that are hot versus the ones that are cool. And in my experience, it can take sometimes over 24 hours for that to happen. What I'll do is leave my hot jars of lard sitting out on the counter overnight, and if I wake up the next morning and it feels cool to the touch but it still looks liquidy and it still looks the golden color, I'll then put it in the fridge and it will solidify and it will end up this nice white color. And that's how it should be. It's much like other fats, like maybe a coconut oil, that will be solid at room temperature or colder than room temperature, but as you heat it up, it will obviously liquefy and it will turn to this golden color. Alright, and there you have it. It's about 2 o'clock and my little boys are waking up from naps, which is perfect timing because we're just finishing up. I ended up with about 6.5 quarts of lard, which is wonderful, and we have all the cracklins to eat as snacks. It took us about 4 hours. We started at 10, so this is a much faster method if you do it on the stovetop like this. But the trade-off is that it does require a little more labor on your part. You need to kind of babysit the lard to make sure it's not sticking and stir it. Whereas if you use the crock pot, as I mentioned in the beginning, you can just fill the bottom of the crock pot with some water, put your fat in, and just let it cook down all day without really having to pay it any mind. And then in the evening you can go ahead and ladle it into your jars. So whichever method you prefer. I used the stovetop today so that I could speed up the process a little bit for the sake of filming this. But we're done now. The process is exactly the same for tallow, which is rendered beef suet or beef fat. And so we also do that sometimes. And while tallow isn't the greatest for baking because it does have a beefy flavor, tallow is wonderful for cooking, and so we'll use that a lot of times for frying things up, and I also use it for soap making. So I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope this will be helpful for you if you're considering rendering down your lard. Just make sure whenever you get an animal processed at a butcher that you ask specifically to keep the fat. In my experience, butchers won't necessarily leave the fat for you automatically. You have to ask for it. So if you don't specifically say, I would like to keep the fat to have it rendered, they will not often include it in your boxes of meat that you go to pick up. So don't let that go to waste. You pay for it when you get your animal processed by weight, and it's just such a shame to lose that precious cooking fat that you could be using to make healthy meals for your family. So that's not a reminder too, because there's some people that don't want to eat the lard or eat the fat because they do believe it's unhealthy. And so ask around if they're going to be getting their hogs butchered or their cow butchered. If they don't want their lard or fat, maybe you could take it off their hands for them. It's a nice way to get some free, healthy cooking fat. So with that said, I'm going to go snuggle my boys who just woke up from their nap, and we're going to get on with our day. We hope yours has been blessed, and we will talk to you later. Bye.